And welcome to 21 Conversations, the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. I'm Shannon Jones, one of the organizers of Greensboro Bound and manager of Scuppernong Books. Greensboro Bound is so excited to present to you these 21 Conversations, our effort to create something unique and special for our community within the confines of our continued virtual environment. 21 Conversations pays homage to North Carolina's rich literary history while broadening our tent to welcome in voices outside of our own microcosm of experience. This featured presentation is but a taste of the 52 authors that we have gathered together for a series of delightful, sometimes unexpected, but always edifying conversations. Since our inception, Greensboro Bound has been committed to providing programs just like the one you are about to watch, 100% free to our community. In order to do that, we need the financial support, both big and small, of readers just like you. Please support Greensboro Bound by giving now. The text to give phone number as well as our website are on your screen. A sustaining gift of just $15 a month or the cost of a single children's book will help us remain financially solvent throughout the year. I also want to take a moment to thank our sustaining supporters without whom Greensboro Bound would not be possible. Our utmost gratitude to the Edward M. Armfield Senior Foundation, the Ruth Lance Memorial Fund, and Arts Greensboro for their continued belief in our vision to bring together readers and writers of all genres, ages, ethnicities, identities, and voices to foster an understanding of writing as a process that allows free expression, deepens critical thought, and helps sustain a culture of inquiry and delight that is open to all. Thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival, and please enjoy the conversation.
Welcome again, Sharon Salzberg and Omid Safi. Thank you so much for joining us at our 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival that we had hoped would be in person, but so much for expectations. But we're super excited to have these 21 conversations. Each one is between someone based in or from North Carolina and a conversation partner anywhere else in the United States or the world. And Omid, you're joining us from Durham, from Duke University or near Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Is that right?
Right here in, as we call it, Durham.
Welcome. And then Sharon, it's a little cooler up where you are in Barre, Massachusetts, right?
I'm sure it's a lot cooler, actually.
Yeah. Well, welcome. And I'll just give a little introduction and then we'll jump right in. So Sharon Salzberg is a world-renowned teacher of mindfulness and meditation, who in the 1970s helped bring mindfulness meditation and Buddhist ideas to mainstream Western culture. In 1976, she co-founded the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, where she joins us from today. She's also the best-selling author of 11 books, including the most recent, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and Our World. And she hosts the podcast, The Meta Hour, which I have been immersed in the last few weeks. I'm so excited to discover it and have enjoyed having both of you accompany me, even though you don't know it, over the last several weeks. It's brought so much light and joy to my life. I feel like this is a continuation of a conversation because I've been immersed in your ideas and observations. And then welcome also to you, Omid Safi, translator and editor of Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition, and professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University. I understand you specialize in the study of Islamic mysticism and contemporary Islam, and you write on liberationist traditions of Dr. King, Malcolm X, and you're committed to the traditions that link together love and justice. And I have more to ask you about those. In addition to Radical Love, Dr. Safi has written several other books, including Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, and the Cambridge Companion to American Islam, among others. And in addition to teaching at Duke, you teach online classes about the Quran, about the Sufi poet Rumi, about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Correct. And once we're past these COVID times, I understand you take people on tours through your Illuminated Courses and tours.
Yeah, that's right. That's been a wonderful experience over the years.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And I just want to show everybody this beautiful book cover, Radical Love. I love that cover. It's gorgeous and real change. And that color, that's the color of spring. That's a robin's egg. Beautiful.
Sharon, I'm color coding for you today. I hope you appreciate this.
Oh, I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Somebody pointed out to me that the color of the cover of my book is also the color of the Statue of Liberty, who has a main role in that book, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. And as I was doing my research, I realized you two have known each other for a pretty long time.
Yeah, Sharon has been a very dear friend and mentor and someone that I really look to for hope and inspiration and guidance and fun also. She has an amazing sense of mischief and humor and joy about her. And it's a friendship that is very, very dear to my heart.
Well, thank you. And as is yours to my heart. And I was reading Omid long before we actually got to meet. And I mean, I'm in a funny time warp as we are these days. I'm not really sure what was a long time ago and what was like 2 weeks ago. But I remember reading Omid. We were each writing columns for On Being at the time, and something would happen in the world. And I would ponder, like, what do I have to say? And do I have anything to say? And, you know, how would it look? And he had the column out, you know, he was so fast. It's like his thinking, I think, was so integrated in his being, is so integrated in his being that something would happen and he would just have a response. And I would think, wow, he's fast.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
beautiful.
That I'm a slow writer. I admire that so much. And just to get us going, you speaking of the time warp that we're living in, both of your books, you wrote them both before 2020. I understand, Sharon, you were able to sneak in a preface after COVID-19 and all those 2020 happened. But you both wrote your books before what we knew was coming, and yet they speak so much to what we're experiencing, what we experienced last year, what we continue to experience. Let me back up a little bit. Could you first share with us your inspiration for your books? And then I'm going to ask my question related to 2020. What I know both of you have written quite a few books. What was the inspiration for these? Sharon?
Okay, thank you. Well, I had begun teaching meditation a really long time ago, like in 1974. And in the early days of my teaching, everything was just open, whoever showed up. And there weren't all that many people who showed up really in the beginning because it was not that well understood and it was not that popular, but people did show up and there were all kinds of people. And as the years went on, there were times when I would more teach a particular population of people. And some years ago, that became caregivers, what we call caregivers. I keep thinking there maybe should be a more powerful word, but people who either in their families, in their personal lives, or professionally, in some ways, were like on the front lines of suffering. And we're dealing with issues of balance and grief and letting go and remembering to take in the joy and all of these things. And they were so close to my heart, these people. And it ranged from first domestic violence shelter workers to international humanitarian aid workers, and now back to frontline medical personnel. And one day I was thinking, who do they remind me of? And then I thought, oh, activists. That's like a whole group of people who are in that same way, trying to help make this a better world, who are dealing with all of those same issues. And I thought, well, I think I was very moved by the possibility of offering contemplative tools to see if that could help sustain the work, the incredible work that these people were doing. So that was a large part of my motivation.
Wow. And again, the timeliness of that idea you had to help people on the front lines of suffering, and people who we, a year and a half ago didn't think of as being lines of suffering, and who are. Yeah. And how about you, Omid? Tell us about, I got a little glimpse, I heard a little something about the inspiration for your beautiful poetry translations. Can you tell us
Thank
that
you.
story?
Authors are notorious liars, and sometimes we all go back and like retrospectively make up these whole biographies as if everything like a mosaic has been fitting together piece by piece to create this masterpiece, and there was an intention in the beginning which led in a very linear way to the outcome, and that would just be a lie, really. I mean, I've written books in that way where I had an outline and I pitched it to somebody. This book really came out of my own very personal love story. My wife and I, and Sharon, by the way, we just had a baby 15 days ago.
Oh my gosh!
So I just have to tell you.
Oh my gosh. Well, I was going to say, tell me more and send photos.
Yes, they will be forthcoming in just a little bit.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, she is an absolute light and a delight. And when my wife and I met, she is from Switzerland and I'm from North Carolina. So for actually a number of years, we had a very old-fashioned courtship of a trans-oceanic letter writing campaign. And everything about it was old-fashioned except for the fact that the letters were exchanged on text messages. And she's very, very Swiss, very grounded, very non-materialistic. She makes a terrible American in this way. And the only thing that she ever asked for was, you are surrounded by these teachings and these poetry and these stories about love and sacred love and everyday love, and how the divine love mingles with the love, starting with the places where there's greatest hurt. And so every 2 or 3 days, she would just ask me to go and find one of these poems or one of these teachings and to translate it in a way where the English conveyed something of the beauty of the original. And then we would talk about it and talk about what it means to us. And then another 2 or 3 days, there would be another poem. And, a couple of years after this had gone by, she was like, well, my love, all of this stuff that you've been sharing, this is so meaningful. I think we should share it with other people. And I was like, no. Like, these are your poems. These are for you. And she was like, well, if they are mine, then I would like to share them with people. And I was like, oh, crap. And so literally the process of writing this book, I kid you not, was scrolling through my phone, cutting and pasting old text messages on a Word document, rearranging them and writing an introduction for them. I've never had something as effortless, as joyful, nor have I ever done anything that has meant so much to people, because I think they've sensed something very moving and very intimate. And I think this goes back to the point that Sharon was making. One of the new insights that I think we're all grappling with today is the fact that the most intimate and the most out there service-oriented, action-oriented, are connected. And people are seeing those connected anymore. Whatever term you want to put on it, love, kindness, care, compassion, this is not something restricted to that most private realm anymore. And I think that's one of the beautiful connections between Sharon's beautiful book and Radical Love.
Yeah, and in both of your books, you're tying the very personal, and knowing the backstory of your book, I mean, deeply personal, Omid, and for you too, Sharon, I mean, you bring in personal experiences that you've had with suffering and trauma in your book, and connecting that to, you know, social change and people who are on the front lines, and who are both living out in what is a pandemic world, and a world that's, this country at least is struggling so much with our reckoning with racism. But again, it's deeply personal. And so that is my next question. Can you help us think about grief and trauma lived in a personal, experienced personally, but also how that relates to grief and trauma that we experience communally? And I'm thinking of George Floyd, I'm thinking of COVID. Yeah.
Well, the other group of people I think I really had in my heart when I was writing this book were people who, I've known through these many years of teaching meditation, who I've seen countless people just become more self-aware, seeing their own fears, seeing their own mind states, seeing their own potential for love and compassion. And I've seen this entire population of people just grow more aware and then more compassionate, more. I've seen people grow kinder. And the classic story would be somebody who would say to me, I was walking down the street and somebody came up to me and asked me for $1. And I gave them $1 because that's my habit. But this is the first time I ever looked that person in the eye and realized that was a human being. I've heard that story so many times, but so many people then didn't know what to do with that except in an immediate personal response to a situation. They felt helpless. They felt the problems, the system was too overwhelming. The problems were too overwhelming. What could I possibly do that would be meaningful in any way? Anything I might offer is so small. And I really, this is where the Statue of Liberty came in. I was studying the Statue of Liberty for this book, and I'd written about her many times because she's been a personal icon for me. That sense of welcome, that sense of you belong, even you, that no one else wants, you belong too. You can find a home here. It was so important for me my whole life. But in researching this for this book, it was the first time I ever realized quite that she was a woman on the move, that she actually she's mid-stride. She's not just like laying back and saying, you're welcome. She's taking an action. And that was very important for me, that sense of agency, that sense of taking our distress or our values or more abstract notions of how the world should look and doing that one step, just taking a step. And I thought about it a lot in times of rage, which can be so awakening in some way. It's like moving us out of indolence or a sense of passivity. But really realizing that if I were to sit and look at my own anger, for example, I will see at some point, of course, strands of fear and strands of sadness or grief, but also a kind of kernel of helplessness. And I know from my own experience that if I can get there and experience the helplessness, then I resolve I'm going to do one thing, even if it seems very small. And so that I think is a very healing moment for coming through a place of trauma, whether it's personal trauma or more collective trauma. And it's very, very important that we recapture that sense of agency and we realize that nothing we do is negligible or unimportant. just like the one little thing we can do in kindness and in honoring connection is really valuable. And I thought a lot about that question, personal trauma and more collective trauma. And I'd love to hear what Omid has to say. I'm still, thinking it through in lots of ways, because one of the most corrosive elements of personal trauma is often a sense of isolation. It's only me. So you would think it, in that sense, realizing the collective experience would bring us to a place where we can address things in an somewhat easier way. And then on the other hand, there's the sense of we need to find something that's intact, something that is whole, something that we can rely on. And that was very much my process, by the way, in writing the preface to the book, because the publication of the book, Real Change, was delayed because of everything that was happening. It was moved from June to September. And a friend of mine was reading the book to excerpt it, and he said to me, I kept reading those examples and thinking, that's what made you anxious? Wait till you see what's coming. And I thought, oh, maybe I better do something about that. So I went to the publisher and I said, could I write a preface that would somehow contextualize everything in the book in this current experience? And they said, okay. So my question to myself over and over again in writing the preface was, what's still true? Like, what can I count on in this time of disruption and anxiety and loss and shattered expectations and all of that? What's still true? And I think that often in a time of more personal trauma, we look to the community for that reference, that they will provide it. And so when everyone's going through something, I'm just fascinated by that process. Like, how does the collective find that and know what we can rely on?
Yeah. And what I wrote a note to myself that I won't be able to find, but you called it a compassionate, your group, your compassionate, let's see, right.
Oh, the Compassion Corps?
Yes, the Compassion Corps. We're learning to do that together by wearing our mask.
Yes.
Our interdependence is more obvious than ever before now. And reading Real Change, after COVID I guess we all read it after COVID, except for your earliest readers. Not after COVID had begun. It speaks so much. It's so healing. It's exactly what I needed. And I have to say, my 17-year-old read it first. And while losing her senior year to online schooling, all these changes that feel huge for a 17-year-old, and was very healing for her as well. So thank you.
Well, that makes me so happy.
Yeah, thank you. Omid.
Yeah, thank you. We are in such a curious moment of reckoning. I'm mindful of the fact that we have come out of a particularly traumatic 4 years in this country. And then on top of that, there's the trauma of COVID. For many people, on top of that, there is the trauma of economic loss of livelihood. For all of us, although to various extent, there's also the trauma of isolation from friends, from loved ones, from embrace, physical touch and embrace of people that we care about. So I think this conversation about grief and trauma is so necessary, so life-saving, life-transformative. I sometimes go back and I think about the teaching of so many sages that talk about you have to love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Establishing a connection between the love and the care for one's own self and the love and care for one's neighbor, not to say even anything about the stranger. And so many people, I'm a teacher, I see this every day. so many people are actually filled with a profound kind of self-loathing. It's no wonder that they can't love the neighbor and love the stranger, because when they look at themselves, starting with this beautiful physical body, there is loathing for the weight and the height and the shape and the color and everything. And then there might be more and more layers of loathing. So on one hand, there is that need to pour that care and that kindness and that love towards oneself. But if we just get stuck there, well, then we end up with a bunch of narcissistic babies. And so there's that urgency of healing the self, but not stopping there, because as Sharon says it so beautifully in the section that she has on interconnectedness, almost all of our teachings talk about how we're not an island. We're actually enmeshed in this web of interwovenness, interconnectedness. And the love that you bring to yourself, if it's not bounded and imprisoned, spills over towards others. And likewise, the grief and the hurt that you inflict on yourself extends towards others as well. So I think part of the issue for us is, how do we come to see that it's not so much that we have to connect our lives to others, we're already connected, right? And COVID is a very vivid example of it. If one person is careless, well, it might be their housemates and their family members and their schoolmates who might then become infected, and so on and so on. Environmentally, we see this, that if one community or one nation is polluting the world, well, then the whole world is paying a price for it. And then I think the last part that I'd like to mention here is, it's one thing to have a conversation about we're all interwoven and we're all interconnected, that every life is precious, every life is sacred, every life has dignity. And I think if you only pursue it at that level, you do end up with something that, for lack of a better term, people call an all lives matter discourse. I think somehow we gotta have a nuanced enough approach that says, but of course, all lives do matter. Of course, every life is precious and sacred. And all lives cannot matter until and unless those who are most vulnerable are seen as mattering, are seen as being cared for. I think that's one of the places that brings us to this moment of racial reckoning in America. We literally have people marching and demonstrating, asking that the forces sworn to honor and protect Black folk not kill Black folk, right? As simple as that. And this is one of the insights that actually a lot of the mystical teachings do offer us, that we're meant to resemble nature. I was reading recently one of the poems of Rumi, and he talks about how we're supposed to be like water. And if you pour any glass of water or watch any brook or any stream, it always flows down. And so he says, be like this flowing water and look where the water is going. Go into those low places in society, those places of hurt and humility, and be the water of life there. And just so I don't end on that note, one of the things I've learned, and I'm trying to still keep learning from Sharon, is she's really helped me move beyond this binary thinking that there are those of us who have the answers and have the compassion and have the wisdom and have the teaching, and then there's the others. And I think her writing and her being has really been an extraordinary reminder for me that everyone has this in them already, that we're not divided between the wounded and the healers, but that every single person is a wounded healer, a recovering wounded. And so it's a matter of seeing that in one another including ourselves, as opposed to somehow falling back on a kind of savior metaphor.
Yeah. It seems like a really good time for me to ask you to read one of a couple of poems that I marked. And then Sharon, if you want to riff off of it, I see connections to real change that I can ask about, but I have a feeling you'll be able to see them quicker. The ones I have in mind, Omid, are You and I, Our
Yeah.
Brokenness, and Remove the Kaaba. Do you want to read a couple of those to us? I wrote down the page numbers.
Sure, that would be great if you have it.
Well, You and I is on 172, and Our Brokenness is on 256, and it's across the page from Remove the Kaaba.
Okay, I'll start with the You and I. This one actually don't need the page number 4 because it's so dear to me. Sharon, this was one of the ones that my wife and I wove into our wedding vows, actually. So if I forget this one, I'm in deep trouble. So it starts, and by the way, there's nothing per se romantic about this poem in the sense that it is a love poem, but it's a love that could just as easily be between the different parts of yourself, you and a friend, you and a parent, a teacher, or a romantic partner in a conventional sense. And I think that's one of the important reminders. I think last time that Sharon and I were able to be together in person was in California. And I'm such a mushball that I very readily fall back on all this love poetry stuff. And she was like, well, if you don't have someone like that, it's okay. You know, think about what qualities would that person have. And that was such a revelation. So thank you for that, Sharon. So this one starts with, faithful friend, come closer. Faith. So just faithful friend, whatever, whoever, in whatever garb, let go of a you and an I. Let go of these notions of a you and an I. Come quickly. You and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. You and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. And I'm so glad you picked that one, Molly, as one of the ones to share, because as somebody who has at times in the past incarnations of life been in relationships that didn't mirror this kind of equality. I mean, I remember times where it felt like your home was an accounting firm. And you were keeping track of, well, I have an itemized list of all the times that I did the dishes and you failed to take out the trash and blah, blah, blah. And I've been saving it all for this moment. And I'm mindful of the fact that there's times in which just letting go of a notion of a you can be really hurtful if you're in a relationship where neither party, or maybe one party, is failing to see the full beauty of another. But when both parties are mirroring that to each other, I think that is such a magical moment where you're not in it for the bookkeeping, you're in it for the love that just pours out effortlessly, naturally. So I think that's a really powerful one.
Wonderful. Would you mind also reading Our Brokenness, and then we'll pass the baton to Sharon to help us think about these ideas. And while you're looking for Our Brokenness, which is on page 256, I just want to say a little teaser. In Radical Love, one of my favorite lines, we're not going to, I think, have a chance to look at the poem, but it's where God is, where the speaker of the poem says, "You are God, not an accountant."
Yeah, that's
Love
right.
that line. It's fantastic. So anyway, another one is, what is it about love and GPS?
Oh yeah,
like these
right.
ancient Sufi poems, love is the GPS. I love that title of the poem.
You know, you got to update some of these translators. The
I
word
love it.
originally was an astrolabe, which was like this medieval
Yes.
device that sailors and caravans in a desert would line up with the North Star to know which way the coordinates are. And I mean, it's a beautiful medieval device. The Romans had it, the Muslims perfected it. But how many of us have an astrolabe in our pocket, right? But a GPS, button on your phone that helps you find your way. That's maybe a little bit more common metaphor. And as somebody who takes seriously the idea that, as a translator, the most literal translation may not always be the most helpful one, that you got to somehow bring it into this current context. So the brokenness one, I'll read that. It says, this one, of course, is another Rumi one. You're clutching with both hands to this myth of you and I. Our whole brokenness is because of this. And, we were just talking, and I'd love to hear Sharon's take on this. We were just talking a little bit ago about the way that this can show up in our interpersonal dynamics and relationship dynamics. But let's go back to the Statue of Liberty. Let's go back to, the poems that are inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty of "Give us your poor huddled masses." And the fact that unless you're a Native American or the descendant of enslaved people, everybody else in this country is an immigrant. You might be a more recent immigrant, you might have come a little bit ago, but Native Americans, descendants of enslaved people, and immigrants. What does that mean for us to have adopted some of the kind of language of we're here and you cannot come, and we're going to build walls and make Mexico pay for it, and people of this and that ethnicity cannot enter? And sometimes those laws are being passed by the very same politicians whose grandparents were kept from coming into this country. So that's another example of a brokenness. It's not that the system is broken. The very people who are perpetuating these systems oftentimes are also suffering from a brokenness, because we have bought into this notion of a binary, of an us and a them, of a you and an I, rather than seeing this ocean of humanity without eradicating the particularity of what makes us who we are. But Sharon, I'd love to know what you think of this.
Well, thank you so much. It's so inspiring to hear you read those poems, and really beautiful. I thought of several things. One, in terms of an earlier comment that you had, I thought of my podcast, and Omid actually has a podcast as well on the same network. But I thought about this time on my podcast, I was interviewing an activist, and it suddenly struck me. I said, what do you think people who have a negative reaction to the slogan Black Lives Matter, what do you think they hear? Do you think they hear only Black Lives Matter, which would be a mistake, and therefore the possibility of communication would actually exist, much more viably? Or do they hear even Black Lives Matter, and that's no good? In which case, more doors are shut. It doesn't mean there's no possibility of communication, but it's much harder. And this person I was talking to said, I think they hear even Black Lives Matter. And I'm not sure I agree with that. And other people I've asked that question to think something other than that. And I think that behooves us to investigate and to try to find out, because if one is hearing and reacting to only Black Lives Matter, there's the open door, to actually try to elucidate, well, wait a minute, that's not what's actually going on. And anyway, so that was just a point about that. This is a time when in so many ways, we are seeing the terrible face of interconnection. You know, what happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there. It comes over here, and what we do, it also matters. I mean, we see gaps in that understanding. People who refuse to wear masks, or, you know, because I work with so many healthcare workers who feel the effects. They are at the other end of the consequences of that. It's very telling to me, but by and large, it's in our face, you know, and the beautiful face of interconnection is the sense of a natural compassion, because it's based on a worldview that is inclusive. It's not just self and other, it's we. Here we are. I was talking to somebody who's a physician, who's the head of a large medical practice in a hospital. And he was saying, you know who I have a whole new appreciation for? The cleaning staff. And I thought, well, yeah, you know, or look at how we perhaps think about that frontline worker in the grocery store. In teaching loving kindness meditation, which I've done for many years, there's a category known as the neutral person, somebody we don't especially like or dislike, we feel kind of indifferent to, and usually we don't even see that person as a person. They're in some way like an object for us. And probably for 45 years, my colleagues and I have been saying, like the checkout person in the supermarket, you know, the kind of person we usually look right through instead of look at. And I heard myself repeating that because somebody asked me to record a meditation. And so they chose that one. So I was repeating it and I thought, whoops, look at that. You know, like, how do we think we get to eat if we're not growing our own food? And here it is. It's right in front of us. So the opportunity is tremendous. And even before the pandemic, I know not everyone, of course, is living in isolation, and many people are. I mean, like doing a Zoom, teaching a webinar, and I read the chat on the side, and, you know, people say, I live in a nursing home, haven't had a visitor in a year, something like that. You know, I mean, terrible instances of isolation. But even before the pandemic, there was a reported epidemic of loneliness in many places in the world. And I used to read about the kind of healing effect of social connection in various clinical conditions. And I kept thinking, it can't just be numbers. Like, I only have 2 friends, I need 5. It must be some inner sense of belonging, of being a part of the whole of life, of connection to the whole. And I think that's what it's coming down to, is that, of course, everyone, you know, who is leaving a more isolated state is looking forward to, although I personally think I'm weird, you know, like I look at photos of people, large gatherings that are old photos, and I think they're standing very close to one another. You know, like, I'm going to have some culture shock in leaving this situation. But it's got to be resting on that inner sense, because it needs to be completely inclusive. And what's potent is that inner sense is real, that we are completely connected. You know, it's not like a fantasy or some sentimental notion. This is reality, that our lives are intertwined, that we're completely interdependent. And I think that could be a gift of this time, is if we come back to that kind of inner knowing.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the paradox of one answer to loneliness is to sit alone in mindful meditation, or maybe in your case, Omid, to sit alone and pray is a way to feel that interconnectedness to the rest of the world, even in these times.
I think it's so strange. It's like, I've thought that for years, you know, like, let's say meditation or prayer or reflection, or, you know, sitting down and reading these poems, for example. It looks like a completely solitary activity, perhaps. Maybe you're doing it all alone. Maybe your eyes are closed as you're reflecting or contemplating or meditating. But somehow it brings us, it's like, what's still true? You know, that's always been true, that our lives are intertwined. And the more clearly we see reality, the closer we come to that understanding. And then it's so natural. It's not, and that's something I've always honored, you know, it's not forced. Like I read a book on compassion, or even worse, I wrote a book on compassion. You know, I really don't feel like talking to you, but I better, you know, act like I care. It's not like that.
Mm.
You know, everything just transforms within us and we see the world differently.
Yeah, it's beautiful. There are a couple of poems about paradox that I'm interested in asking you to read, if you would. I mean, but first I want to ask you both about the word radical. It's in your title, Omid, and it's probably in Real Change several times, but it jumped out to me in the part where you talked about Roshi Paco's radical openness as he was sitting at the side of someone who was in the process of dying. I want to hear you talk about the word radical. And for you, Omid, why you chose it as your radical, what is radical love and what is radical openness?
Well, you know, I'm like my dear friend Sharon, I'm also given to a little bit of mischief over here. And people like me who come from a Muslim background, many people of color, Black folk in particular, you know, we're very accustomed to the word radical being attached to us in particularly negative ways.
Oh, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For a second, I was thinking of like the 1960s. Is that when the word radical was a popular word? That's why I was smiling.
Yeah.
Now I know where you're going.
To be described as radical meant to be a sympathizer towards communism, which might be true in my case, at least to socialism, and then being anti-American, anti-government, dangerous, all those kinds of things. And I'm trying to help recover and redeem and replant this word radical, as also with the word love. Like, you know, love has become so mushy, so sentimental, so sexualized, that I think it's much more helpful to have a very expansive, generous sense of love towards a child, a parent, a teacher, a friend, a kitten, a puppy, a brook, a breeze, God, and maybe also a partner, but just one layer among others. I think the word radical has a couple of meaning that comes out of the Sufi tradition. One of them, and this is shared with English, the word radical originally meant to go back to the root of something. So the most radical gesture is to recognize that, you know, we're now in the beginning of the spring season here in North Carolina. The dogwoods are in blossom, and it will come to Sharon's neighborhood in just a few weeks or so. That the life of the tree that we see in the blossom is already contained in the roots. And that the winter time is not a time of death, it's a time where the life of the tree returns to the roots to be rejuvenated and return as a blossom, to return as a fruit. And likewise, we are in need of this. We can't always be in a period of doing and manifestation or even action. There's also the time for repose. There's also the time to return to the root of our being, or as we would say down south, to the roots of our being. Rumi would say you have to go back to the root of the root of the root of your own tree of life, right? So what is it that sustains you? What is it that feeds you? What is it that nurtures you? And to recognize that that might change. It should change during the course of your life. Maybe at one point, it might be to go for a nature walk. Maybe at another point, it might look like prayer. It should always look like meditation. Maybe at some point, it could look like service. And what if the thing that fed your soul when you're 20 is no longer the thing that feeds it when you're 50? What if the prayers of your grandparents are in a different language or in a different symbolism that doesn't work for you anymore, well, then you find the ones that do work. So I think there's that, the radicalness of it is that perpetual examination of the root of the heart, the deepest part of the soul, and to find out how are you truly doing, and how can you keep nurturing it to the utmost. And the more life in your roots, the more fruit you have to offer others. But if you're just running out there to do things, even if it's with the best of intentions, and neglecting to water the roots of your own tree, at some point it will wither.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
I love that sense of trying to redeem words. I've said it about my own work, especially in writing. Love is one of them. Faith is another one of them.
Yes.
Because there's so many words that I've often said, for example, with love, that in a way we live in a time of the degradation of love, you know, as a concept, that we think of it as a weakness or something kind of gooey or sentimental or strictly in romantic terms, and we don't understand perhaps its strength and its power. And so I love that feeling that we're both dedicated to that kind of redemption of language.
And what does that mean, Sharon, when you described Roshi Paka's radical openness, as he said, like, I want to live in radical openness. What does that mean to you?
Well, in part it means really paying attention to what makes us happy and what brings us suffering. And this is a complex and sometimes painful examination of myths we've been told and what we've been led to believe, and how liberating to come to our own understanding that, you know, many people, for example, are taught that vengefulness is strength, like hold a grudge forever, you know, and never let it go, or it's a dog eat dog world. Don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And you can just feel like the isolation and the contraction that comes when you're paying attention. Or certainly many people are told compassion is for suckers, or generosity is for losers, or, you know, all kinds of things. And we have the chance through paying attention to actually see for ourselves. And that is a radical act, you know, not to just buy into sort of conventional understanding of where we need to go and what we're capable of and what our lives are about and what brings us happiness and what just kind of makes our lives smaller. And it is an extremely radical thing to do because you're stepping away from a lot of assumption and a lot of conditioning. And it's also totally magical because it is such a process of discovery.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to skip forward. How are we on time? Yeah, we don't have that much time, and I have so many questions. There is, I want to talk about joy. And there's so much joy in both the poems and then in particular in your chapter about joy. Growing up in the Protestant tradition, joy and guilt, like especially in times of COVID and especially in times of strife, or you know, people who are struggling in this country with poverty, racism, homophobia, ableism. How do you keep the joy without turning away from the suffering? And I'd like to start the conversation by asking Omid, if you wouldn't mind reading. I marked the poem. Now I have to find it. You might know which one I'm thinking of. It's the very short one. Why didn't I mark?
Is it one
Joy
about?
Inside the Heart. Page
Yeah.
90. Joy Inside the Heart, page 90.
Yeah. So this is the the answer that one of the sages of the Islamic tradition had given when someone had asked him about what is the path, what is the spiritual path, And the very short answer he gave was, it is to find joy inside your inner heart when sadness comes. To find joy inside the inner heart when sadness comes. And as is so often these kinds of sayings, it's a bit paradoxical. What does it mean to find joy when sadness comes? And I think part of what he's talking about is a twofold notion. One of them is to, as Rumi says at one point, perceive your emotions and your thoughts as your guests, not so much as the totality of who you are. They're your visitors rather than you being entirely them, right? So, I mean, and language here is important. We make worlds through our words. But, when somebody says like, I am angry, right? Angry, like we're equating our I-ness with angry, instead of being like, oh, look, here comes anger. Yeah, I know this guest. You've come here many times before. I know how you behave. So, and Rumi uses the metaphor of a guest house where in the medieval times you were allowed to stay for 3 days for free, and then you would be on your way. It's like, yeah, come on in, anger, and hang out for a while. I know in 3 days, metaphorically, you'll leave. What would it mean to treat sadness that way, right? At one point, Rumi says, like, you are the most faithful friend I've had, sadness, because you just come back so often in that period of deep melancholy of the soul when his teacher had gone away. But what makes somebody a sage is that also when happiness and joy comes, to have that same gracious approach, right? You're not just identifying with the joy and treating sadness and anger as temporary guests. No, you're gracious to all of their emotions, all of the thoughts. And then because this is taking place in a God-centered kind of a context, there's also the notion that the one who sends joy is the same one who sends the sadness. The one who sends the rain is the same one that sends the sunshine. And we were talking earlier about how love has to be redeemed, partially because anything of value is commodified. Anything of value is utilized by a capitalistic marketplace. And if you don't do that, then you end up with God as a Santa Claus. That God, it becomes the heresy from my point of view. That's the gospel of prosperity. God wants you rich. Well, what happens when you lose your job? God wants you to be healthy. Well, what happens when your loved one gets cancer or COVID? Like, does God hate them? No, the one that sends the challenge is the one who also sends the remedy. And sometimes the remedy comes through humans, through those humans who are making the vaccines and distributing it. And the person at the checkout counter who helps check out your groceries, or the delivery person who might be bringing it to your home as well. So I think, yeah, that's just a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Any thoughts to add to that for us, Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, it's very beautiful, and thank you always, Omid, for your wisdom and your joy. Actually,
Yes.
I know it's very hard. It often brings up questions of guilt. I mean, to some extent, I think it is a matter of self-examination and being realistic. Like, where does resilience come from? Because to crumble in the face of pain and to feel completely ineffectual, to go back to the Statue of Liberty, not to feel that sense of agency, to feel overcome and shattered is not going to help you, and it's not going to help anybody else. So I know the common experience is of guilt, and like especially in times of such rampant distress, like how can I possibly? But this is what helps buoy us up. And it's like an ingredient in the resilience, and we need that resilience. It's like we need self-compassion. We need to be able to take in the joy not to the exclusion of acknowledging the pain, but because that's how we get to acknowledge the pain without just falling apart, because it's easy to fall apart. And I think that's part of it. And part of it is learning to hold many things at once. One person in the book that I had interviewed, actually many people in the book are from the Parkland, Florida community, where there was, of course, school shooting. And this one young woman, Samantha, is one of the people that was interviewed for the book. And her mother is a teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the shooting happened, and was not hurt, but it was a totally traumatic event for the entire community. So I went down there. I was invited to go down there the same year as the shooting, just a little bit after, and I taught. And Samantha sat that workshop, and she raised her hand at one point and she said, "I feel really weird because I'm having this incredible day, like being with you and learning these techniques, and it's really incredible, but I know the only reason it's happening is because that horrible thing happened. And I don't know how to get over that in order to really take in this and enjoy it." And I said, "I don't know that we ever get over it, but we learn to hold them both at once." And we talked about the term equanimity in the Buddhist psychology. We talked about the yin yang symbol, where there's like the circle of darkness in the light part and the circle of light in the dark part. And we have to hold them both at once, the joy and the sorrow, the sometimes terrible reality and the immense possibility. Because if we're only caught in seeing the awful reality, we're caught, we're stuck. At the same time, if we only see the immense possibility and we can't acknowledge the pain, we're just floating somewhere. So when the book actually launched, I did a series of YouTube things, panels and things like that. And I did one with people from Parkland that I moderated. Samantha was on there. So I said, "Hey, Samantha, remember that conversation we had a few years ago when I first went to Parkland about equanimity?" And she said, "Not only do I remember it, I think about it every single day of my life. That it's become kind of my North Star as I try to navigate through the ups and downs of life." So there we have it.
That's so beautiful to hold both. And something else that helped me that I read in your book is, and that you've talked about in other places, is just this idea of beginning again. And I think I heard you say that in January you marked 50 years since you began meditating. I'm marking 50 years this year too, but not of meditating. 50 years since I joined this earthly world. But
you know exactly what 50 years feels like.
I know that's a long time to have been meditating.
Yeah, it's shocking. Yeah.
Wow. And what keeps you coming back to the meditation cushion every day? You can send us to your 12 books you've written, but in a sentence or less.
I've written 11, but I'm
11.
about to start another one, so someday it'll be 12. I just see, of course, it's so natural to me at this point, but when I think about what's still true, what am I counting on? What am I relying on? This is what I'm relying on. And I'm just so grateful for some skills of centering and creating some space and kindness toward myself and kindness toward others, which are really all originating in those practices.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I have a short last question for both of you. It's a double question though, so I'm kind of cheating. But I understand that you are both huge Hamilton fans, and that delights me that you both know the words to the songs, that you are completely taken by it, and how exciting that it came out just at the beginning of COVID and we could actually see the performance on our own TVs or computers. So my question is, two-part question. What has brought you delight in the last year? And secondly, what are you enjoying thinking thinking about or working on right now? That's another way of saying, is there another project or a kernel, a seed of a project that you have some excitement for? So those are two-part question. What's brought you delight in the last year? And it can be just a song or tell us about your favorite Netflix show, whatever it is. What's brought you delight, and what are you excited about or enjoying as far as your, what you're thinking about? Either one of you can start us off.
Well, I'm now filled with delight at Omid's poems, so or translations. And so I have the book right here, but I'm gonna go back and read it much more slowly. I had a funny thought that came up, which was really it was a more negative, like I'm really enjoying not traveling incessantly, which is not a thing exactly in the positive column, but I thought, oh, right. Like all that time, not only was I on airplanes, but where am I going to stay and who's going to pick me up at the airport? And what about, and I thought that's a lot of time that I've recaptured. That is really interesting. And I am about to sign another book contract, maybe 2, just to drive myself crazy. And it will be about like a lot of what we've talked about, I think, so I'm excited. I mean, there's always that feeling of like, I'm not, which is actually tied to Hamilton. I don't think I have anything else to say, but I was working on this book, Real Love, which came before Real Change. And now I'm on the real train. And I was in a very bad period of discouragement about writing, and I was late. And I thought, this is just like, it's not going to happen. It's your 10th, this is being very honest, it's your 10th book. Nobody cares what you have to say anymore. Just like turn something in. And it was just then that a friend brought me to see Hamilton on Broadway, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote it, was still in it. And I kept staring at him thinking, you wrote this, like this came out of your brain. And I thought, you could never do that. You could never compromise. Everything you do, you just have to do like with all your heart and put yourself totally into it. And so that was my first Hamilton moment.
I love it. And I can't wait to read what you bring to the world next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to tell you that there was a period of time where I think Sharon and I were exchanging just as many notes about Hamilton as we were about nuggets of Sufi wisdom and Buddhist insight. And it's like, did you see this one thing that just happened about Hamilton?
I love that. And our household was equally immersed in all the songs.
Yeah.
So I appreciate what you're saying so much.
I love the fact that, it also gave me such a bonding experience with my children. And, like when you're in that state of effervescent joy about something, I had gone back to a meditation practice, and they had, some of the same people had come 2 years before when I was in peak Hamilton obsession mode. And they were like, we thought that you were still going to be making all these Hamilton jokes because that's all we remember from 2 years ago. I have that same experience as Sharon has had about writing, sometimes being filled with joy and wonder, and sometimes really just being an intensive process of labor. And so, for a while I had that little line, Hamilton wrote the other 51, stuck to my laptop as one kind of note of encouragement. In terms of what's keeping me going, Molly, I'm thinking about you very graciously mentioning about being in this realm of existence for 50 years. And I entered that same state just a few months ago. And it's that reminder that, we've been breathing for 50 years. And when you actually learn to pause long enough to just watch your breath go into the heart and then come back out, everything slows down. And you feel like you are in a more harmonious state. And these days, when I'm holding my newborn, she makes the funniest sounds in her sleep. And I find that my breathing is conforming to her breathing. So this morning, she was going like, and then I was also doing that. And she's the greatest meditation teacher that I could hope for, alongside Sharon, where in that moment, I'm not thinking about writing my next book. I'm not thinking about translating this poem or filling out this, form and answering an email. I'm only bringing my whole being into harmony with her breathing. And there is pure joy and pure presence. And how amazing that the more present you are, the more joyful you are. And the more distracted and scattered you are, the more miserable you become. Imagine that. In terms of, stuff that I'm kind of looking forward to doing, one of the, I think gifts would be too shallow of a word, given how much suffering there's also simultaneously present, but outcomes of this quarantine has been that my wife and I decided that, we're going to keep writing books, but there's also the opportunity to have conversations like this. And this isn't just the absence of face-to-face meeting, it's also its own thing. It also opens up possibilities. So we ended up setting up these series of online courses called Illuminated Courses. They're open to anybody. And, recorded them, put them out there, and then we have monthly gatherings. And the first time I did it, I was like, 2 people are going to show up, and it's going to be like so embarrassing to have done all this work and have 2 people come. And I think we had like 750 people from around the world who signed up to go through that. And, the numbers are only what they are, but it's that sense that we're figuring out some openings, some possibilities of having that sense of community. And some of that community is with ourselves, with our thoughts and emotions, with our loved ones, with our neighbors, with our friends that we wish we could hug right now. And then some of it is with fellow seekers from around the world who might be inclined to breathe together and to learn together and grow together. And I think that feels like a tremendous realization at this moment also.
Yeah. Oh, and what we all need. We need more of your words and your wisdom, both of you. Thank you for your presence here today, for your presence in the world. And there is a special intimacy to us each being in our homes and at the same time being together. Thank you for taking this time. It is truly a gift. I know how busy you both must be right now, and this is actually a special joy for me, getting to be with both of you today. Thank you so much, and I wish you health and happiness, joy, and radical love. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Molly. Bye, Sharon. Great to see you.
Bye.
Be on the lookout for those baby pictures.
Yes, I was just going to say baby pictures, baby pictures.
They're coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you again for joining us for 21 Conversations. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share with your friends and fellow readers. One final reminder that Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization committing to bringing together readers and writers throughout the year at zero cost to our community. Please help Greensboro Bound maintain that commitment with a sustaining or one-time gift now. The number to text to give and the website are on your screen. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in person next year for the Greensboro Bound Literary Festival.